Welcome to Unforbidden Truth. I'm Andrew. On this week's episode, I'll be speaking with Judith A. Yates. Judith is a true crime author who has decades of experience with her law enforcement background. She's published 7 books to date. She's the only journalist that continues to cover the disappearance of Tabitha Tutors, a high-profile missing child case in Nashville, Tennessee. I speak to Judith about 2 books she has published, Bullied to Death and When Nashville Bled, the untold stories of serial killer Paul Dennis Reed, the work she has done with the world-famous Dr. Henry Lee, the process of writing a true crime book, and much more. Here's my interview with Judith A. Yates. I'm here with criminologist and true crime author Judith A. Yates. How's life in Kentucky treating you?
Oh my goodness. I love Kentucky. Both sides of my family are from there, so it's my roots. So I'm a happy cat.
Before we jump into it, give me a little background about yourself.
Yeah. I have over 30 years in law enforcement and investigations. I am a Texas girl. Woohoo! And I have written 5 true crime books, 1 nonfiction, and soon to be 2 fictions. I worked in custody, investigations. I worked with the sheriff's office, and I have been a professor for the last few years. So that's basically it in a Yates shell.
You've published quite a few books. I want to talk about 2 of them, the first being Bullied to Death. Tell me a little bit about the case and everything that went into writing and researching and publishing the book for that matter.
I was already working on a project on another book, and I saw this photo of this little girl who, according to the media, had committed suicide in front of her bullies. And the little girl's aura in her photos just kept touching me because I thought, here's this kid, what would cause a child, 14 years old, to kill herself, and what would cause her to kill herself in front of the bullies? I don't have time for that. I just can't take on another project. But the strangest thing, I don't know if you believe in paranormal or strange things that happen to you, but as I'm writing my book, I keep looking at the news reports to see what's going on with that case with Cherokee. Her name is Cherokee Harriman. And I could feel someone tapping on my left shoulder. And I am left-handed. And I kept thinking, okay, I'm imagining things, but it was persistent. And so I started the Cherokee Harriman book. I contacted her family and said, if you don't want me to do this project, I won't. They all agreed, which I always ask families first for their permission. And it came from that. I interviewed, I don't know how many family members and friends and acquaintances and relatives, and even her biological father, who was in another state. And it just went from there. And I felt the story of Cherokee Harriman should be told. Also, I felt that this bullicide charge needed to be looked at. Are kids really killing themselves over being bullied? Is this a media invented thing? What exactly is this story? And I contacted more professionals about the situation. And the next thing you know, the book happens.
Are there any criminal charges that can be pursued with instances like this, whether someone's a juvenile or not? Because I do know bullying happens in the adult world, unfortunately.
Well, after a complete investigation, it was determined that it wasn't bullying, it was a fight over a boy. And this is where it gets difficult, Andrew, is there is no one definition for bullying. It varies state to state, it varies school to school, and it even varies in the media. I could say, Andrew, you're a jerk. Is that bullying or not? Well, it just depends. It depends on where we are. It depends on, law enforcement investigation. It's just so many factors. No one was arrested for this incident, and it's still up in the air. Did Cherokee kill herself? Was it an accident? Was it because she was being bullied or got into a fight? And is it just the accumulation of so many things in her life that, she was acting out, and the acting out went farther than she thought?
Did you get to interview any of the families of the girls who were allegedly bullying her, or the girls for that matter?
I talked to one, and the rest of them, the families, this is very strange to me. Even though the book is based on bullying and what bullicide is, and to educate people, I got so many responses from parents, and this isn't just the parents of the kids that were there. We don't want to get involved. We want to just forget about it and move on. My kid is innocent. My kid wouldn't be mean. And some parents just refuse to return calls. But here's what's interesting, is I had these kids who were there. Some of them wanted to talk to me, but because they're juveniles, of course, I have to get parental permission. And I would even have to tell them, look, you need to stop. You can't tell me this without your parents' permission. And of course, I never used that information in the book. But what's interesting is, again, the parents didn't want to get involved, some of them. And I even was told, we just need to forget it and move on. And she needs to go on with her life. He needs to go on with his life. Look, you just stood there and watched a child plunge a knife into her stomach and fall over dying. Do you not think that that is going to affect this child the rest of their lives? Also, is one of the people involved, he texted someone else and told them what happened, and his only thought was, I'm going to get in trouble.
Was the boy that they were fighting over present at the time when she did this?
Yes.
What was his reaction? Did he try to stop her? Did he try to calm things down, or?
Well, first she was at the park and the kids weren't talking to her. She was alone. Oh, I'm sorry. One of the kids went up to her and tried, according to the child, tried to get her involved in a conversation. Cherokee was sort of despondent about the conversation. In other words, she answered yes or no or hey. Then she got up and started to leave. Well, one person in the group started name calling and yelling. Cherokee turned around. She starts yelling. They get into it in the street until all of the kids jump in and say, okay, look, it's not worth it. Quit before it moves to fisticuffs. And that's when Cherokee headed home to sneak the kitchen knife out of the house in return. When she plunged the knife into herself, she wasn't close to these kids. She was standing there. Some kids didn't even understand what she yelled. And then they all stood there in shock, as you can imagine, because when they realized what was going on, and Cherokee is laying on the ground, with the knife by her side and there's blood, then they go into sort of a shock. And remember, these are kids. They're 13, they're 14. Remember what it was like then. And they started calling people, their parents. Two of the boys jumped on their bikes and rode to Cherokee's house, which was right down the street. And they grabbed Cherokee's phone and dialed the first name in the phone. And it happened to be one of Cherokee's friends. So nobody is thinking, let's call 911. They're all calling parents and friends and family. And it wasn't until Cherokee's dad arrived and he called 911.
Did she die on scene, or was she still conscious when the ambulance arrived?
She was still alive legally, and her eyes were rolled back in her head, and she was still warm but somewhat immobile. They called an ambulance, and then the ambulance notified Life Flight. Life Flight had to come get her, take her to Vanderbilt Hospital. They operated, but it was too late, and she went into a coma. Her family was told, there's no way this child's going to come out of this coma. What do you want to do? And the family opted to remove her off life support.
While you were interviewing her parents, I'm assuming shortly after this happened, correct? It was probably still very fresh then. How was that atmosphere, interviewing her parents when this just happened?
When you work in the business that I worked in, you learn to either disengage yourself or tamp down emotions, and I did both. I cried with them. I cried while writing the book. There were several times I had to walk away from the book because it was so emotional. This is a little girl, a child. And the more I investigated this suicide and bullicide, there were kids as young as 7 years old taking their lives. How does a kid know to do that? And what would make a kid take their own lives? Some of them died by hanging, some of them jumped off bridges. What would cause that? I'm an adult and I'm terrified of the idea. So that's what I wanted to know. And her family, I just love them. They've become my family, which a lot of books happens. And they were happy to talk to me because, one, they didn't want this to happen to other kids. They were adamant about this. If Cherokee's life can teach anyone anything, it's this. And secondly, very few people outside of the family has ever asked, tell me about Cherokee. Tell me who she really was. And they became advocates for bullicide and children's suicide. So I really commend them for having the strength to do that.
During your research that you put into this book, what were some of the more common types of bullying that go on?
I researched bullying. I researched this dynamic called bullicide. I, reached out to many professionals for interviews, and I talked to the kids. I talked to their parents. I talked to their families. And what's interesting is every kid I talked to, and there were dozens, has contemplated suicide. And these are, 9 to 15-year-old kids. There's really no such thing as bullicide. That I learned, and the media immediately jumps on, they killed themselves because they were bullied. That is not true. Every child that I researched, and again, this is difficult because these are kids, and a lot of the records are sealed, and a lot of families, quote, don't want to talk about it. So bullicide really doesn't exist per se. A child is usually experiencing problems at home, emotional issues. Many of them have dealt with sexual molestation, problems in school, which all of it begets the other, really. Problems at home, school, social life. And this builds and builds and builds, and being taunted, called names, ignored, left alone, no friends. And again, this all kind of, flows in together. That accumulation creates the suicide, or even the attempted suicide. And with Cherokee in particular, I think it was sort of the end result, the straw that broke. As is with so many of these kids, is it just builds and builds and builds all of these issues, which again are interwoven, and they take their own lives. Cherokee was not only, quote unquote, bullied in the school system with the kids, also the school system itself, medical help, psychological help at home. Her mother was the product of a very bullying, mean father. And so bullying really encompasses quite a bit. And that's another issue that I wanted to bring to light in the book, is bullying just doesn't happen on the school grounds. But because Cherokee had been sexually abused, one of the issues with sexual abuse as a child is they either want to constantly bathe or they don't. So then you go to school and everybody's saying what a stinky kid you are. Also with Cherokee, her family didn't have the money to buy her the fancy cell phone, the fancy clothes, the little trinkets that these kids love so much, money. She just didn't have those things. And that also made her an outcast. Here's this kid walking around with the newest cell phone right off the shelf, and they're making fun of Cherokee because she doesn't have a cell phone. So it's little things like that that build up.
You wrote a book about deceased serial killer Paul Reed called When Nashville Bled, The Untold Stories of Serial Killer Paul Dennis Reed. For those who are listening that might not know who Paul Reed was, can you talk a little bit about him, his crimes, and what happened to him?
Paul Reed was born in 1957. And by the age of 3, he was setting fires. He tried to set a fire on his grandmother's bed as she slept. The flames came up, the grandmother smelled smoke and had to put it out before she was burned. He also was killing animals. He was stealing. He would steal clothes. Paul would steal off of anything. Even as a kid, Paul had sticky fingers. He was stealing everything. As soon as he could reach a mailbox, he was stealing mail out of the mail. So this is a kid that even at the age of 3 and 4 is showing some antisocial personality disorder and so many signs that things are wrong. The grandmother was very elderly. She was the one who was raising him, and she just didn't have the resources to deal with him. So he was put in a home. His mother finally came and got him after so many years. And as a teenager and as a young adult, he was committing crimes, stealing cars. Then he turned to robbing restaurants. He was caught robbing restaurants. He was put in the Texas prison system, which is not, I mean, that's a prison system you don't want to play. And of course, when he turns into the prison system, he turns into this whiny little bitch that's crying and crying. Oh, they're so unfair to me. He gets out of prison. He's in Texas. He travels to Oklahoma, Chicago. And what's funny about Paul is he had these petty jobs, like he worked in a bakery, he worked in fast food, he worked these jobs that did not pay much, but he always had fancy guitars, fancy Western clothes. Paul's aspiration was to become a country and Western singer. He told people he was the next Hank Williams. If you could hear him sing, your dog would howl. All the dogs in the neighborhood would howl. But he was convinced he was going to be, the next Garth Brooks. So he travels to Nashville to make it big, ends up working in fast food while he's going to all these, you have to understand Nashville. There are dozens and dozens of places where an amateur can go and play hoping to get discovered. So Paul is trying to get discovered. It's not happening. He needs money. And when he was in the Texas prison system, he told a fellow inmate, next time I'll do it right, I won't leave witnesses. Now, mind you, Texas had, the prison system had so many letters in Paul's file from professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists saying, do not release this individual. He is a danger to others. But he was released. So let's go back to February 16th, 1997 in Nashville at a Captain D's. Paul talked his way in before the store opened, and he shot at point blank 2 wonderful people named Steve and Sarah. Sarah was a kid. She wasn't even out of high school. Steve was an adult who was working his way up to working the executive department at Captain D's. So he shoots them point blank, he steals from the safe, and he leaves. Well, he's needing money because, a couple of $1,000s isn't going to cut it. So on March 23rd of that same year, he walked to a McDonald's right after closing, walked up to the door, and forced Andrea Brown, who was 17, Ronald Santiago, who was 27, Robert Sewell, who was just out of high school, and Jose Gonzalez. He forced them into the McDonald's. He made Ronald empty the safe, and then he had them lay down, face down, and he shot them at point blank. He shot Andrea, Ronald, and Robert. Now, Jose is laying there, and he's hearing them die. And Jose says, I've got to do something. So he jumps up and starts fighting. Now, Paul Reed is a huge guy. He's over 6 foot tall. Jose is smaller in stature, and he's only, a little over 5 feet. Jose fights for his life. And Paul Reed stabbed him over and over 20 times. Jose finally plays dead, and Reed runs out of the restaurant. Well, the cops were hot on his trail in Nashville. This was a huge case. So Reed moves to Clarksville, which is almost an hour away. And on April 23rd, 1997, he talks his way into a closed Baskin and Robbins. And what I think happened is Michelle said, you better get out of here because my brother's going to show up anytime to give me a ride home. Michelle was only 16, but she was a spitfire. And she was working with Angela Holmes, who was only 21. Angie was keeping a 4.0 at a very prestigious college. She had a newborn and she had just gotten married. And she was able to juggle all of this plus managing the store. Well, he took them hostage and he drove them to a nearby park and he killed them. He was eventually caught and he received 7 counts first-degree murder, which is the most that Tennessee has ever dealt out, in 1999. Of course, he went through the numerous appeals process and played crazy as best he could. And then in 2013, he became very ill. They took him to a hospital and he died in the hospital.
And I know at one point in time he was considered a suspect in the Brown's Chicken Massacre, right?
Right, he did not commit that crime, but there are several other crimes that we suspect him of. There's one in Texas. Actually, there's a few in Texas. I'm sure there are more crimes across the country because he did travel and he did need money. And as I said, you don't work a minimum wage job and be able to afford all these fancy guitars. He was always a member of at least one gym. The guy worked out constantly. And besides being tall in stature, he was also very, very built, very muscular.
You're the only journalist that consistently follows and reports on an 18-year-old missing persons case, the case of Tabitha Tutors. Tell me about her disappearance and the details surrounding it.
Tabitha, she's another kid that had a trying life, let's say. And she's walking to a bus stop one morning. Now, her mother always said, if there's no other children at this bus stop, you go down the hill where there are children. In other words, don't stand at a bus stop alone. So Tabitha leaves one morning. She walks down the street. Nobody is at the bus stop. So she walks down the hill to where the other kids are. A car pulls up. She waves at the driver. And then she gets in that car and she was never seen again by family or friends.
How long have you been covering the case?
Oh gosh, 10 years?
What got you interested in wanting to cover it?
I was teaching. I had started teaching and this is how I got to Nashville, at a school in Nashville. I was opening up their new CJ program, criminal justice program. And one of the things that I did is I took local missing kids, missing people flyers, and I pasted them around the classrooms. And one of the kids in the class said, Miss Yates, she was my friend. Because Tabitha lived in what people like to call a sketchy neighborhood, but I grew up in that kind of neighborhood. It's good people. It's just the bad people that make it bad. Does that make sense?
Right, right.
It's the majority of just good people who want to live their lives. So nonetheless, I started talking to my students, and a lot of them knew of the case because it had made such huge news at the time. And the anniversary of her missing always comes up on the news.
Does anybody have a theory on what happened?
All of the above. There's a story that she ran away. There's a story that she was taken. There's been some suspected child trafficking involved where they got her addicted to drugs and then she was on the street. There are so many theories as to what happened to her. And of course, it's 50-50. She's alive, she's not alive. But you know what? Regardless of what happened to this kid, regardless of what she did or didn't do, she's a missing child. And she's somebody's missing child. And she's got a family and friends that love her very much. And we want to know what happened.
In the past, you've worked with Dr. Lee. Tell me a little bit about Dr. Lee's background and the work you two have done together. I know he's a legend in the industry, to say the least.
I love Henry. He's so good at what he does, obviously. And then he also has this great sense of humor. And his wife and I always, his side story, his wife and I always compare dogs. Like we show each other pictures of the dogs. And finally, Henry will say, "No more dog pictures." And it's so funny because he likes animals, but he doesn't love them as much as his wife and I do. So we show dog pictures like we show kid pictures, but he is so, anything he says, you could just soak up. And I spoke at one of his symposiums on serial killers, and I discussed the Reed case. And that was that was an audience composed of mostly law enforcement, profilers, investigators, and then you had students in the audience. So it was very thrilling. It was a lot of fun, and it was nice to share the information. So we've met at various get-togethers, training seminars. Actually, I'm going to see him again this coming October at another convention or conference, rather, where he's the guest speaker. And I'm going to get to see him in person again. So he's just, I love working with him.
Has he ever talked to you about the cases that he's worked on? I know there's so many: John Bonet, the Hellcrafts wood chipper, O.J. Simpson, Lacey Peterson, 9/11, the DC snipers, JFK. There's so many that he's worked on, and it's the fact that he's just a legend in the community. Or at least I would say he is.
Oh, definitely, he's a legend. I mean, the knowledge this man has, and he has spent his entire life, working, studying on crime. And we've discussed it briefly, but really, what can you say about the Jean Bonnet case, for example, that hasn't been said? So I tend to focus on the, I guess you'd say, smaller crimes that happened. And his most memorable case was not any of the above. It was an elderly woman that was killed for just a couple of bucks. And he said the reason it stuck with him is because here's this woman. Nobody came to claim her. Nobody went to her funeral. And he said the thought stuck in his mind, what is this person's life like? Why don't they have any loved ones around? Why don't they have any friends? It just really hit him in the heart. And that's another thing about Henry, is he is so dedicated, but he doesn't forget their people. Now, when you talk JFK, talk to Dr. Cyril Weck, because he can talk about the JFK case.
Before we conclude this interview, is there anything that you'd like to talk about that we haven't covered yet?
Well, I've got a lot of irons in the fire here. I've started a company called Best True Crime Games, Books, and Video. I'm working on 2 board games with a group, and we're hoping they'll be released in 2022. And the board games deal with true crime. I have 5 true crime books, 1 nonfiction and 1 fiction, soon to be 2. I'm wrapping that one up. And of course, I've got that video series on YouTube called Best True Crime that just started. All of this information can be found on truecrimebook.net. Another project that I've got in the works is a true crime events page, where if you're interested in going to a conference or training or guest speakers, book signings, true crime book, new releases, then you can go to this one page. And I'm working on it with a wonderful author named Sonova Cantrell. She is an expert on organized crime, as we were just discussing that. But she's this amazing author, amazing person. So we've created the True Crime Events page, where people can just go, kind of a one-stop shop, and see what's going on in true crime. And again, this can be found at truecrimebook.net. And I encourage people to stop by, say hello, see what's going on in the world, and see what events are going on.
When you say you're working on true crime board games, now is that something similar to like the serial killer trivia game, or is it something family friendly, I guess you could say, in a sense?
I will never write, work on, create a project that makes serial killers or any other criminal look beyond what they are. And they're punks. Every one of them are punks. Paul Reed preyed on innocent people. He shot them in the back of the head. He was a punk. He wasn't anything special. And that's how I view it. Serial killers aren't cool. They aren't anyone to be admired or to be interested. They're punks. So I'd never do anything that, took that myth of them being subhuman or a Hannibal Lecter type, and I won't touch it. But the two board games, one has to deal with true crime media, and the other has to do with a very famous case that was never solved that took place up east. And that's all I can say.
That was my interview with Judith A. Yates. Thank you for listening.
Unforbidden.